In this video, we're going to talk about HR strategy. It's a hard thing to pin down. I don't find that many people who, really want to talk about that, but we are going to dig into it a bit today. That's coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, and this is the HR Hub. On the show, you get expert insight into anything that has to do with HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or podcast to keep learning from my guests. Today, my guest is again Len Nanjad. Len and I did some episodes last year on organization design, and they're some of the most popular episodes I've done to date. He thinks deeply and strategically about HR things, and he's also a consultant with MNP, so I'm glad to have him here. Hi, Len. How are you?
Hi, Andrea. I'm great. Thanks for having me here.
Great. All right. So we're going to focus just on HR strategy, or as much as we can anyways. So what are some of the important components of HR strategy?
The most important component of HR strategy, so defining an HR strategy, is of course understanding the business strategy and then using a similar structure to define how HR will help the business or the organization it serves to win, as we've said before, right? So those four components are having goals, clear goals, understanding the products and services that you provide and how those fit with those who you're providing them to, right? So it's called product service or product market fit. And the core activities, so what is it you actually do, or what accountabilities you've been delegated to deliver as HR, and then your unique value proposition. How do you do that better than anyone else? So, and that last one is a tricky one because it also explains, have you ever been in a company where you've spoken to a leader or a manager that says, I don't think we need to involve HR here. They can't really help. They can't really. And then meanwhile, back on the 10th floor, the manager of HR is going, man, I could totally help that happen. And it would have been way better than that manager trying to figure out and do it for himself. And I'm here to do that. Right. So why does that happen? So you're competing for actually this accountability of leaders and managers saying, well, I'm accountable for the wellness and productivity of my people. And HR is just here to make sure that people get paid on time. And they usually bring in all these HR speak and policies and different ways of thinking that really just make it cumbersome for me, right? So HR really needs to think about how it's winning in the game of helping management to be helping management to win, helping management to be effective. Right? As I've said in other conversations we've had, productivity is the goal, right? And there are many out there who are like, well, isn't it about the whole person? Isn't it about engagement? Isn't it about inclusion? And isn't it about success? Just on your own terms? And the answer is yes to all of those, but in service of what? Right? The ultimate goal is that the human being feels productive and able to contribute to their best of their ability, and that the groups of human beings feel the same way. And that then when you measure it all up, the organization, this fictional construct, is actually measuring some results that make it seem more productive and winning in some way. Mm-hmm. That's what drives everything else, right? So thinking about those four things are really the components of strategy, but it helps you link to the business strategy, which is the critical thing for an HR strategy, right? You're not doing HR for the purpose of doing HR well. You're doing HR to help the business win. So this is where you need to make trade-offs to say, do we really need to do HR best practice here? Well, maybe if it's a legal requirement, there is no best practice. There's only staying on the right side of the law, right? And if you're staying on the right side of the law, you can simply comply and do the minimum required, or you can exceed. That's a discretionary choice. And that's where you have a strategic choice. We can be strategic about it and say, All we need to do is use the minimum compliance tactic. And that's where you've done some strategic RSA, we'll do the minimum.
What's your perspective on those situations where, the employee, and they come to HR a lot and they'll say, I can't believe the organization does this, and then or doesn't do this, and then they extrapolate all the meaning out of that. You don't care about me. You don't care about employees. You don't care about the end product. You're going to fail as an organization. And then I do think we get drawn into those things that people think we should be doing, but we never actually thought clearly about whether or not those are going to help drive organizational value.
Yeah, I think you said it better than I would have. Right? It's really constantly asking about why would we do that? What is the importance of that in connection to the effort I would have to spend and the benefit it would provide, and who is the recipient of that benefit?
Yeah, I think too often we just do it as like, someone, pulled on my emotional heartstrings or whatever that expression is. And it resonated with me. I think we should do those things, and let's do those things.
Yeah. And I don't want this to come off as highly Machiavellian or, utilitarian. All you're thinking about inputs versus outputs, or just being mathematical, or just cold, heartless about this. Right. We are ultimately humans, and as human beings, we create human outcomes, right? And so there are different forms of humans that interact better with different ways of being human, right? Just because we're human doesn't mean that we're going to be effective together. And there are many different ways of being effective together in the pursuit of a common goal, right? And so this sort of bridges into the next thing around getting to an HR strategy, right? So if you have those four things, right, you might say, well, what are the core activities of HR? Like, we really need to break it down now. The products and services and the core activities of HR are things that really are the domain of an HR strategy. So I kind of put it into 5 nice, neat, alliterative buckets, but it can be as varied and as complex as your organization requires it to. But you start with purpose.
Okay.
Then you figure out pay. And I'll come back to pay in a second. Then you think about pathways in terms of how are you growing, how are you developing, and how are you given accountability to exercise that growth. Performance management. So how do I provide feedback? How do I know what good looks like? And how do I share that so that I can actually participate on a pathway that I just talked about, right? Mm-hmm. And the fourth is probably force fitting the P's, but it's about productivity or productive environments, right? So this can be about your organizational structure. It can be about your management systems. It can be about role clarity within your positions and the way you work with your colleagues, up, down, across, inside, out, network, whatever it is, and the tools you have to enable you to work, right? So purpose, pay, pathways, performance management, and productive environments. You think of those 5 things, and those are generally your 5 core elements of what an HR strategy needs to address.
Okay, so now we've talked about the pieces of the strategy. How do you go about developing the strategy? Like, what's the process?
Yeah, great question. And again, the way to think about that is this similar way of how an organization overall would develop its strategy, right? So the first step is understanding the environment in which HR operates. And there's probably 2 components of that environment. The first is, well, what is the business strategy? Like, HR is operating in the environment of a business strategy for which it serves, right? Like, I am helping a business, so I need to understand the actual overarching organizational goals, core activities, unique value proposition, and product market fit. Okay, so I understand that. I get that strategy. And then I need to understand the culture of the organization that I'm working in. So what is the nature of the culture here? What is it that we have today? And what is it maybe that we intend to have in the future and probably the near future? So there's what we have, what we want to sustain, and what we want to change and grow and develop into in order to support the business strategy, right? And then you break down the components of HR accountability, which you talk about, those 5 Ps. What are the components of activity and accountability in those 5 Ps? But the missing component in there might be about, well, what are the goals of the HR strategy for a second here? Like if we're forming an HR strategy, if the goal of the HR strategy kind of falls on the core, basic, super minimum required HR function, right? So the goal is basically keep the organization out of jail. So be on the right side of the law. So that, that would be your purpose. Your pay would be make sure that we pay people on time and accurately, or that they get paid on time and accurately if you're outsourcing it or finance is doing it for you, right? But it really comes down to an HR and employee relations thing. When somebody wants to complain about their paycheck's not right or not there. So then you have your pathways. So it's like, well, we just outline what it takes to get promoted. And if the minimum required is when your manager says you're ready, that's what we do to make sure we communicate that. Make sure that we have a clear way for people to understand how they're being assessed in their work, so performance management, and make sure that we've got things, systems, tools, and a structure in place that can help people get their work done. Okay, cool. Those are those 5 Ps again. Those are my core areas. And then I can get more detailed, more sophisticated, and more interconnected from there. And that goes then all the way to, people and culture is a core component of our organizational strategy overall. In fact, we can only win based on our HR strategy. So then we get into a really important and necessary thinking about those 5 Ps in a much more integral way to how the organization wins, not just supporting the organization to win, doing what it does, but actually being a part of how the organization wins. And that's another, that's super strategic HR, or that's actually where your HR strategy needs to be now integrated into everything and the way the organization operates.
Are there times when HR strategy we're secondary to the business strategy?
Oh yeah.
Okay, give me some examples. Because we always say you can't get anything done without your people.
Yeah.
Aren't your people your strategy? I don't know.
Well, that's kind of why HR was originally called human resources in my mind, right? It's a form of resource.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how do I build, buy, or rent that resource?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's probably the first strategic question of your small h, small r human resource requirement. Right. So I need people to get the work done. Do you? Can a machine do this? Can we do this through AI? Can we do it through different mechanisms? That's the first thing. Right? Mm-hmm. And is that cheaper, better, faster than actual human beings doing it? Okay, there's a value proposition there that you need to think about. There's a substitute factor there for human beings, right? Or not, right? It's like, well, there's no better way for us to do this than having people. Mm-hmm. And for whatever combination of cost, availability, capability, accessibility to all those things, right? There's all these kinds of choices, but we get into sort of HR trade-offs. If we stick with the topic of how do we get to an HR strategy, right? Think about your external environment, think of your business strategy, understand then the structure of your HR strategy and the components of it. And then that has to be linked with what the limits that we just talked about is like, how strategic is HR? Is it really just a core basic keep the lights on function, or is it a differentiator that helps us win, right?
Mm.
And then within HR itself is what are the differentiators that help us win as HR, that help us actually drive greater value than the managers themselves that think that they don't need HR to do it, right? So how do we add value better than the managers themselves can add value? And it's not to compete with them, it's actually to support them for it to work better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly not to replace managers either. But it's that kind of thinking. So then you look at all of the different options that are available to you. You compare them to your criteria for what would work best here. That's why you need to know about the culture right up front, right? That's one of your criteria. And then you select from those options and you come up with a set of, okay, here are the key ways we're going to win as a business through our people.
So something I've heard lately is that, we used to do these like 3-year strategic plans and that's not relevant anymore because things change too fast. What are your thoughts?
They can be a bit contradictory on it. I think that the world and businesses are getting far more dynamic, far more complex.
Mm-hmm.
And that forces us to do two things. It forces us to be highly dynamic, highly interrelated, and highly emergent. So business strategy is not a static thing. And there's a school of strategy that says, well, it's emergent. You don't just sit here, take a year, plan it, and then follow that strategy for 3 to 5 years, and then see how that goes, and then shift our strategy again 3 years out. Like that, people are like, did you go through the pandemic? That didn't quite work for us, right? So emergent strategies are happening more and more. It's just like, okay, well, we have all those levers. Remember those 4 things I talked about? We have those components of our strategy. What's shifting? Do we need to change our goals? Do we need to change our unique value proposition? Do we need to change our... And so if you have those components, you can revisit them on a quarterly basis. Can we shift our capabilities with it? And capabilities is where HR comes in to say, like, hey, last quarter we needed people who can smile. This quarter we need people who can smile and say hello. Can we do that? Right? But it is dynamic. Yeah. And the thing that is, it's interdependent though, right? So, there is the environment, there's our strategic response to the environment, then there's our structure, and closely related to that is how do we lead and the leadership that's required of that. And all of that is within the context of the culture, right? So those 5 things actually are all so closely linked. And if they're all dynamically changing, you're shifting those all dynamically as well, right? And sometimes they get out of sync, which is why I get called. Our structure just hasn't kept up with our strategy, or our culture hasn't kept up with our changes in structure, right? And you could say, well, doesn't one lead to the other? And the answer is no. It's all interdependent. Like you could say, like, well, what if we change the culture? Then we could totally change our strategy. Like, well, what if you change your strategy? Then you'd have to try to change the culture in order for that strategy to work, which is typically where we get into this issue of, well, this new strategy is going to require a cultural shift in order for it to work effective. Yeah. And if the culture doesn't go with the strategy, well, the strategy will fail. We won't be able to execute on that.
It's systems thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you work on changing the culture, how do you work on changing the culture?
Oh my God.
Right. You don't change culture. You don't change culture by working on the culture.
Wave your magic wand.
Yeah. There's no such thing. You do things differently. You behave differently. You act differently. You aim for goals in a different way. You aim for different goals, and you communicate those mindsets. Well, that requires different leadership. It requires different structures to support that. It requires different ways to get at that thinking. Right. So the culture is interdependent with everything else that's going on. Right. It's that systems thinking view. It's like, well, if I only could change the culture, then I could get the strategy I want to deliver. Well, then you're going to be sitting around for a long time because the culture will do whatever is being asked of it and whatever it wants to do. The other part of it is that they're also highly static, but there's certain characteristics that stay the same all the time. Right. And it's like that old saying that the only constant is change,
Mm-hmm.
right? So organizations, people, human beings, groups, and organizations are aligned around a common outcome, goal, result, have some things that stay constant, right? It's learning and growth. Right? So you need to have guiding principles that allow for dynamic processes to work, but the core outcome still remains consistent and constant. We're all looking to grow, and we're all looking to figure out, what do I need to change and what do I need to keep the same? And that's kind of the juxtaposition that we're in. Is there's a whole bunch of things that need to change very quickly, and we're changing those very quickly, but there's a whole bunch of things that are becoming very, very clear that need to stay very, very rooted and grounded. And that's why organizations all over are understanding the need for being a purpose-driven organization. That's why individuals all over are understanding that the core to their mental health is having a personal purpose and being connected to your personal purpose. And it's things like that that are just fundamental. So watch out for the fundamentals and then keep the fads at bay. But your fashion, what's working, is definitely a highly dynamic place to play.
Len, we have to wrap it up because we're running out of time, but any final thoughts?
Well, in terms of business strategy, the thing I would say is make sure that you're as clear about what you will do as you are clear about what you will not do. Strategy is equally helpful to help you understand what you will not do and why you will not do it. Because there's an abundance of good ideas out there. There's abundance of good strategies out there. And you have to be really clear about saying no to them and why you're saying no. So that's another thing to keep in mind around your business strategy and linking your HR strategy and your HR planning to it. So that would be one of the key things. In terms of an HR strategy, I would say that the main thing to do is keep it simple. It may be hard to keep things simple because these are actually complex topics, complex matters.
Yeah.
But eliminate the needless complexity and complicatedness. So understand the difference between making something complicated or having a simple solution to a complex problem or a complex situation.
Thanks, Len. I enjoyed this, and I especially like those 5 Ps. They resonated with me, and I look forward to the editing because then I'll put the text in and then we'll see, I think, a little more clearly how one trickles out of the other. Can't talk about it anymore, though. Len and I did another episode on business strategy and HR planning, and the link to that's right here. Thanks for watching out there. We'll see you next time when I talk with another insight.